Hello, hello, welcome. My name is Meredith Gershenson. I'm a research analyst here at workforce.com. And as the slide suggests, we are going to talk a little bit about how to forecast your schedule based on demand. Today I have with me, as always, Bo Gerznich, the organizational specialist here at workforce.com. Bo, thanks for coming.
Yeah, of course.
Awesome. And then we have a very special guest today with us. We have Jack White. He is a labor economics PhD candidate at the University of Chicago. Jack, thank you so much for coming.
Hey, no problem.
Awesome. So Jack's research focuses on the use of big data to better understand employee incentives, compensation, and productivity in firms. He is also the co-founder of Alando, an AI data product that helps businesses manage frontline teams and optimize their labor operations. Cool. So to quickly give everybody a lay of the land of BigMarker, our webinar platform here, we have a chat box to the right. Feel free to throw in any questions you have in the chat and we'll be sure to get to them. We also have some poll questions throughout the webinar itself. So those will just be sliding right on the bottom left of your screen. Feel free to answer those. And again, it's just a good way for us to engage with you all and kind of get a sense of where everybody's at. And then finally, at the end of the webinar, we do have an audit for everybody. It'll just help measure your organization's use of qualitative and quantitative data. And finally, just a little background on workforce.com. We are a workforce management software company who specializes in scheduling and time and attendance. So our overarching goal is really just to help business leaders and frontline managers make the best decisions for their company. Cool. So to give you guys a quick rundown of what we'll cover today, we'll talk a little bit about the impact of over and under scheduling staff, the best practices when it comes to forecasting data or forecasting demand, and then what demand data you should be taking into consideration. Finally, we'll go into some actionable solutions and steps to utilize data for your schedules. Great. And then Jack, I would love to kick it off to you and just kind of talk a little bit about the cost or the price tag of overscheduling.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, and maybe actually just for us, I guess it's worth thinking a bit too about the macro context here, because I think even sort of a couple of years ago, there's this real sense that, forecasting demand was going to be very much just purely making sure you have the right number of people at the right time. And I think just given how tight the labor market is now and how much businesses are thinking about trying to keep their workforces happy, is also having that in the back of mind. So when you're forecasting demand, we're also thinking about, how can we make sure we're delivering sort of, reliable and predictable schedules. Of course, I think, that kind of ties in here, because I think when we first think about something like the cost of overscheduling, it seems at first it's kind of obvious you got sort of too many people that you need. You're leaving money on the table. I think, just to go back to that sort of broader macro point, I think it's actually interesting to think about the impact on employees too. So a good example, I know that when we've worked with Workforce, looking through a lot of, for example, the data that you guys collect through your feedback features, you literally see in sort of the comments that employees are leaving that, when they're overscheduled, they'll say, there were 3 times as many people as we needed today, and I was incredibly bored. And so, obviously, as this cost of overscheduling in terms of, you're leaving money, your labor productivity is low, but also, it's very bad for the employee experience as well. I then think sort of to go perhaps to the less obvious side is, the cost of underscheduling, because as then, whilst there's been this like really big previous focus on cost, I think there's now a sense in which we want to think about how you can use your labor force to really drive your incremental sales. So I think there's this like common sense in which you can just sort of forecast your sales, and you're going to convert that into a number of staff. And now I think we've got to a point where really we want to think, well, actually, how can I be thinking about like my getting my staffing number right, so I'm like converting customers, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So a good example I think there's a lot of studies actually coming out of like Wharton at the moment where you say one of the really important things when it comes to getting your staffing levels right is if you don't have enough staff and you've got people coming through the door, you know, they're just going to walk away, right? People don't want to wait. You know, people don't want to wait in line.
Yeah, I've definitely done that. So it's interesting. I always think it's interesting. The whole idea of 40 hours in a week, there is research behind that, right? The kind of an optimal degree of work, or what would you say about that?
I mean, I think it's quite interesting too to think about. I mean, I know that there's lots of, I mean, there's a lot of research recently in terms of how much do your employees value predictability, or you know, how much do employees value like the ability to have like a flexible schedule. But of course, one of the overarching things that comes through is actually when it comes to a choice between like regular 40 hours work a week and a flexible schedule, employees like much prefer having the like, you know, the predictable 40 hours, if that makes sense.
Right.
That makes sense. I think
sorry, go on, Jack.
No, like I said, but again, it's this point that I think when we think about, I think, you know, typically when we think about like forecasting, like, you know, demand, it's almost like it's a very just like cost-driven exercise. And actually, like, you know, one of the real costs of, you know, underscheduling is, say, you've got customers coming in, you want to have the like your best people at the right time in front of them, you know, essentially being able to offer them the level of service that's going to bring them back again and again. And the difficulty is that's very hard to measure. So, you know, it's very easy to measure a payroll cost. You see it every week. But how can you actually like get the attribution for a good customer service experience meant that, you know, a customer came back in the future?
Right. I think it's interesting to kind of measure up the idea of the fluctuating demand of just the day-to-day, right? And we'll kind of go into that later, but also trying to match that up with the manager's want for that predictability and seeing if it can even be possible. And, you know, with a lot of the work that you do, I'm sure you're seeing that it is actually possible. It just requires, you know, a lot of input from a lot of different factors, both external and internal.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, you know, that's a great point, because I think a lot of the time when we think about, you know, forecasting demand, you have in mind that we're, you know, you're forecasting, you know, customers. But I think in a lot of cases, customers are only a small fraction of sort of how busy your staff are going to be. There's quite a cool study actually from the University of Chicago with sort of Gap, the clothes retailer, where I think as much as sort of like 50% of the like unpredictability is coming from like inventory or unexpected like corporate visits. And so, you know, actually being able to do a better, you know, I mean, one of the, you know, taking a step back and really thinking about what you want to like forecast in the first place, like what is your like driver of work essentially, is actually one of the most important things you can do.
Definitely. And it's a big question, I think, that a lot of people often ask themselves, and it most likely ranges from industry to industry, even whether or not you're in the hourly workforce industries, right?
Yeah. So I think I mean, of course, a big one is, I mean, a kind of a funny thought experiment is, I think, you know, traditionally, you know, one of the biggest sales drivers, particularly, so let's say, like, you know, retail hospitality is going to be like a sales number. And the difficulty you have is, of course, that, you know, we think that sales number is driven by the number of staff that you have. You know, so you want to think, you know, you can imagine this thought experiment where you use sales to forecast demand. You use that number to pick how many sort of staff you want. But let's say you get it wrong. The number's too, you know, you underschedule, and because you underschedule, you turned away. You know, customers didn't want to wait in queue. They turned away. So you adjust down your schedule, and this becomes like a spiraling cycle, if that makes sense. You know, there's a fun sense in which, you know, like just taking a step back, wanting to think about what are you really trying to forecast, like what's really your like driver of demand. And I think, you know, we're starting to realize now that you know, your staff are driving revenue in some sense.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, you know, in a perfect world, it would just be like your staff levels and your sales per labor hour will be perfectly correlated, you know, matched up exactly, right? Where everyone's kind of pulling their own weight, but that's again, in a perfect world. So it's not necessarily feasible all the time. It always depends on those, qualitative and quantitative, internal and external factors. Definitely.
Awesome. I mean, maybe that, up to you, though.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about lately the difference between passive and proactive sales, where when you're managing productivity on like a proactive sales role, it's a lot easier to identify, the revenue you're bringing into the company. But on the passive role, it's kind of what you're saying, if you have someone on manager or on duty that, typically just creates a better environment, and you see a correlation to that in the data, they're passively increasing the revenue by that. And it sounds like that's something that, the data is pointing to.
I mean, I think, and there's big questions too about, how can you actually like use your data in some sense to work out what like an optimal staffing level is going to be? Because when you think you're going to be like, and just to go to that point, when you think you're going to be really busy, obviously you're going to want to go and have more staff. So it's not ideally you'd have like a random experiment where you randomly pick out yours, right? You randomly overstaff some, see what happens to output, and you can use that to make an informed decision. I mean, the reality is you're not going to, that's going to cost a fortune, and you're not going to do that. So, I mean, a lot of what, in like the research world, the approach is you say, okay, what happens when people accidentally what happens when people accidentally don't turn up to work, for example? So someone calls in sick, and they'll try and argue that gives the sort of random variation to let you infer this like mapping from number of staff to output.
That's interesting.
Maybe
yeah, go on.
No, after you.
I was just going to say, I really quickly just wanted to touch on the poll question that we had for this slide, asking what percentage of your labor force works overtime hours, and answers are kind of across the board, right? A lot of people are saying less than 30%, 30 to 50, even 50 to 70. And again, it only proves more deeply that this is just something that fluctuates so much. And, everybody has to kind of pick up some slack every now and then, even if it's less than 30% of your workforce, needing to put in those extra hours because somebody called out, because there is an absence, anything like that. So it's something where it's constantly ranging and it's constantly fluctuating.
Which I think is it's an interesting point, right? Because when we look at the data on trying to work out what's driving retention, for example, right. It's the uncertainty around hours is one of the biggest drivers. So if you're suddenly jumping from sort of 20 to 30 hours like each week, it becomes for an employee that becomes incredibly difficult to organize your life around. And you're going to go leave and go to an employer who is giving you some predictability there.
Oh, definitely. But even then, can predictability ever really be achieved without tools like Alando? Is that something that's
I mean, again, and to say, going back to this thing, I mean, maybe it's a good chance now to start thinking about what the data sources you really want to use to make an informed decision there. Because of course, I think there are some. If you have a POS integration, with Workforce, for example, it's then very easy. You know exactly what that seems straightforward. But I think taking a step back, there's actually a huge amount of data that you might reasonably want to use to forecast your demand. So I think one of the important things to be thinking about is, going back to this conversation having before, first and foremost, what do you think is your real demand driver? So if you're a hospitality business, for example, you might want to be thinking about a combination of how many people are, foot traffic through your door at any point in time, and what are the best sources of data that you can sort of leverage to give you a more accurate sense of what that number's going to be. How can you leverage data between your sort of nearby stores, for example? To what extent do your promotions and marketing materials, are they going to have an impact on on your demand. The weather is like, I think we see with a lot of the hospitality businesses that we work with, is one of the bigger drivers of demand there. And I think there's all sorts, and again, going back to this like anecdote earlier with looking at like employee feedback, for example, I think maybe at first you would never think that that's like a good not an obvious like source of data, but your employees are on the ground every day. They know the business far better than like any like bird's eye view can give you. And so trying to use that data directly becomes really, really fruitful.
Definitely. Bo, I actually have a question for you. Like, we're looking at the slide, and it seems like almost a pretty vague slide, but in a sense, it's right on the nose, right? It's any relevant piece of information. So when we're talking, obviously, scheduling, a lot goes into that. When you're talking with organizations, when you're talking with a lot of this management level positions, are they understanding kind of what data is? Are they grasping, kind of needing to know what kind of data they need? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think this slide's interesting. I actually think data, despite its simplicity of a word, can be kind of a scary concept for a lot of people to think about. There's a lot of things in the news and stuff about big data and all of that, and invasivity. But the reality is that what we're talking about here is just trying to predict the amount of work that needs to be done, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the amount of work that needs to be done means different things for different teams and different locations and different industries. And I think that's kind of what we need to get to the crux of, is like, what is it that we're trying to predict for each of these individual teams? When you think about a hotel, when you think about the context of a check-in and a checkout as data, as work to be done, you could have 100 check-ins in a day and 0 checkouts. What that data would mean would be basically there's a lot of work to be done at the front desk, and there's no work to be done with housekeeping or those more reactionary teams. So I think those correlations, those two demand streams, the reality is they're just numbers, but they mean a lot of different things to different teams and locations. So being able to understand how much work needs to be done and quantify it in a way, that's really what the crux of it is. And of course that varies for, locations and all that.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, that's a great point. I mean, of course, you think about, a good example too, think about all the different data you get. For example, if you're a retail business with a sort of large store footprint, you want to be using the different data you have across the different areas of your store, because like you say, like if you've got a bunch of customers waiting to pay at like checkout, you absolutely want to make sure that you're like clearing that. And for example, you do have data on how much time is there between your like transactions, for example. Similarly, if you've got data on very high value sales, we know that high value sales is one of the areas where having customer interactions can be with your employees can be the most important. With sales staff on a floor can be the most important. So again, it's like realizing that this data is like how you would want to use each individual sort of like data stream can vary a lot. And and at the end of the day, it's all well and good having a really, really good like forecast and getting that number right, but having some domain knowledge about what you want to do with that number is sort of equally important for converting it to a business outcome.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Awesome. I would love to kind of move on a little bit towards talking again about that quantitative aspect. Jack, and we kind of touched on this, but I'd love to hear your thoughts here.
I mean, I think maybe it's useful. I mean, the framework that sort of we have for thinking about quantitative data is sort of very much on a case-by-case basis, exploring which of the various data sources are going to be like most important for any given location, for example. I think one of the big lessons is that a lot of ultimately like nearly every business and even like every business location is unique in some sense. And even if there are like common patterns of demand across locations, so for example, you get a big peak in demand at lunch, you get a big peak in demand in the evening. Even across those locations, depending on where they're based, you can see like, quite a lot of differences. So I think the sort of framework that we have for thinking about a problem like this is to almost, you want to start by bringing everything in, and then essentially, question which of these like quantitative data sources are relevant for a given location. So quite a common, I think, well, sort of industry standard now for dealing with sort of forecasting problems is to take a large number of different sort of models, aggregate them together, and use that aggregation to make the best possible forecast you can. What's super interesting is to sort of look sort of beneath the black box in some sense, and for each of those locations, try and get a sense of which data stream was either most useful for forecasting demand in a given location. And I think, you see it like cases where anecdotally, like events can be like particularly important, and talking to members of staff like in that location will say, we know that, when there's a Chicago Bulls game on, we're going to be like rammed afterwards. And you see that borne out in the data, some of the events APIs that we're pulling from. You see those correlations there, but you'll see, the other side of the city of Chicago, for example, and that will be completely irrelevant. And I think it's, trying to then essentially, again, like pick these data streams in a data-driven way, in order to, actually get a sense of, what's going to be most useful for you trying to make your sort of scheduling decisions.
Yeah, I think the one that I'm always interested in sharing is particularly about that weather piece, which I think is a really good example of how these quantitative data pieces impact businesses in different ways. So like a company that does stuff at water parks is going to want really good weather, whereas a movie theater is going to see increase in demand in bad weather. And it just kind of depends on people's reaction to this, outside quantitative data that's getting funneled in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great example too, right? Because I think when we think about like demand, you forget that has a real. I mean, those are the sorts of things that actually have a really big like impact, like intraday. So take your water park example, and let's say the weather's bad in the morning. Like, if you plan to go to that location as a customer on a given day, you'll wait until the weather clears up and you'll go in the afternoon. But if you're then making scheduling decisions, that's pretty important, because you've got a huge amount of like demand that essentially then gets backloaded towards the end of the day. And so, if you're not thinking about that sort of thing, you've got, far too many staff at the start of the day, and then not enough people in the afternoon to, actually like, help people out.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
I also think, kind of going off of that point, Bo, the weather feature is something where it's almost like data at its simplicity for a lot of managers, right? They don't realize that they're taking it even into account. They don't realize that they're doing, demand data crunching with their schedules when they're looking at weather and kind of trying to figure that out manually. But it's a great starting point, and it's a really good kind of analogy to explain there's weather, but there's also so many other aspects to take into consideration. And quantitative data specifically, I think is kind of the root of what a lot of people think of when it comes to data. It's those hard numbers, it's those sales, it's that foot traffic number, it's even the weather, it's the temperature. And I think, that kind of leads us perfectly to our next slide, where qualitative data is the harder aspect, or maybe even more so the big question mark when it comes to scheduling off data, right? Jack, I'd love to hear your thoughts a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's I think it's kind of interesting too, right? Because when you think about the history of like how people have like addressed workforce management as a problem, there's big histories in operations research studying allocating people into shifts. and it has this very mathematical, like, write the problem down, solve the problem, and assume that that's like the best answer. And nearly always you find that these, when you think about the problem that way, it takes a huge amount of configuration, because exactly like you say, the reality is every business is unique. And there's a huge amount of information that you lose when you try and just like formulate something as a explicit math problem. So, the ones here are like great examples. Like, your managers are the best people when it comes to knowing, who is the best person to perform a specific task. Or, someone's dropped out at the last minute, you need to get a new worker in, right? Who is the person that you're going to like call up first? And I think, one of the big, the big approaches that we've taken is to say, well, within your workforce management system, you have all the, you can see what your managers are doing. So even if you can't, extract that information, it's just so much rich qualitative information that you can't pull it out yourself. You can try and emulate what managers are doing. And I think that's then trying to think about the problem, perhaps less so in the sense of, I'm going to go away, I'm going to write down this like math formulation. I'm going to try and I'm going to try and optimize this thing, and there you go, there's your answer. And think about it more like, something like predictive text. So, if you're sending a message to like, an email, and you have sort of, predictive text is going to try and finish it for you. There's not a sense in which there's like, an optimal like way for you to respond. Like, okay, it needs to satisfy like the rules of like English grammar. And in the same way, you don't want to generate schedules that are like not compliant or are going to be like, quite clearly egregiously costly. But at the same time, like, there's a huge amount of nuance in terms of what a given manager might like to do. And so I think thinking more about the problem through that lens of like predictive text in some sense is quite a good analogy for thinking about exactly that sort of like qualitative information that managers have.
That's a great analogy. I love that. Bo, a quick question for you. So, when you're explaining this concept to managers, HR ops, whoever you're talking with, just organizations in general, how do you kind of go about explaining this aspect? Because I think this would be the hardest thing, if I were a manager to grasp.
Yeah, well, I do think that managers, when you tell them they know best, they like to hear that. But the reality is that this situation about, battling this math, imagine a scenario in which like you take a math test and you fill out all the answers, the teacher grades it, and you end up with a 60%. You take the exact same test 2 weeks later and you end up with another 60%. Because you gave them the exact same answers, you went through the exact same thought process, nothing changed, you didn't learn from, the results of your actions. That's kind of a lot what the math based scheduling does. And so, I think the ability to come to people and say, hey, we will never know the business like you know the business. That's why we want to lean on you as the expert. So that we can get that 60% up to, a 90, 100%.
Right.
I think that kind of helps paint a picture in a better way.
I think that, yeah. I mean, I think that's great. I mean, a helpful thing that whenever like sort of we're thinking about like what the goal is, I mean, you can imagine for every, like, I mean, exactly to this maths test analogy, every time that you go and create a schedule, keep track of how many times that schedule gets changed subsequently.
Yeah.
And, within the confines of whatever you do, you want to generate something that is, compliant. Your goal is to try and make sure that like number is like, is such that ideally the manager is not having to change what you generated at all. And I think when we sort of first started thinking about this problem and look, you go and look at what people are doing currently, quite often you'd have some sort of optimizer, purely, a pure like math formalization of the problem. It would generate an automated schedule. You then go and look at what the manager does, and they go and spend half a morning like changing what it generates so that it looks like something they can use.
Right.
And that's not meaningful automation in any sense.
No. That's more like a 30%.
Right.
But it's kind of funny because I think you see, but then exactly the same, like you say, like maths test, like, you know, and then you go and do exactly the same thing the next week.
Yeah.
Because I mean, you know, unless you change how you wrote down the like formalization of the problem, nothing's gonna change.
Yeah.
Right. People are getting F minuses on their schedules. It's not a good look for anybody. But you know, I think kind of moving on to the next slide, I would assume, you know, a lot of people in the audience would, if they were to map out their schedules, you know, a lot of people are using like Excel spreadsheets, even pen and paper, where they're just seeing the numbers, right, in a box. But if they were to actually map it out on a graph, I would imagine a lot of people's would look maybe like something on the left, where it's constantly kind of missing the mark, so to speak, where if you were to do something with data usage, it would hopefully look like something more on the right, where it's actually demand and staffing levels are lining up pretty well. You know, Jack, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but talking a little bit about like the dynamic aspect of data and how it's constantly changing with the time, with real time of how demand is going.
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of an obvious thing that jumps out looking at this is when you look at sort of generating a demand forecast, you know, pick a demand driver. Let's say let's say foot traffic, for example. You can see the extent to which you can decompose that demand forecast into its sort of like individual like components, for example. So you can see that a large part of that demand is coming from the fact that it is a Saturday, and you just know that your Saturday, you know, you can see in the data that Saturdays are always going to be, you know, busier than the rest of the week. But on top of that, you know that there are these other factors that you know, actually find slightly harder to forecast. So take something like the weather. You know, maybe only with some certainty you can predict from sort of 3 days out. But if you know that that weather component is only a small fraction of that Saturday component, let's say, then it's much easier to get to this like predictable sort of on-demand state on the right than it is in a world where you know that your you know that weather component is going to be sort of 25% of your total demand.
Right.
And so I think being able to use that knowledge about the the demand forecasts, that you can actually really like address this like directly. Ideally you'd want to be able to give schedules more than 2 weeks in advance to all of your employees. And so clearly that's not always possible. In this case where your weather is essentially going to determine like 25% of your demand on a given day. That makes that harder, but just having that information in front of you so you can make sort of the these decisions about how many people you need to allocate and at what time, essentially makes the problem a lot easier.
Definitely. I really quickly just wanted to cover this poll, which I think touches very much on this slide, of course, and what we were just talking about. But does your organization tend to overschedule or underschedule? A lot of people are kind of split between the two. And again, if you were to schedule more like the graph on the left, you would know that this makes sense, that a lot of people are kind of doing both, right? And it's probably even a 50-50 within each of these responses. And I would love to talk a little bit about Jackie's question in the chat. She asked, we've run into a lot of turnover because of burnout. Do on-demand schedules take this into account? In other words, is it dynamic? Jack, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that's great. I mean, I think we know when we've looked at sort of like the retention data, that that's very much a real phenomenon. I think what's important too is again, this like variability in and predictability in schedules that's also important for that retention piece. And so I think I guess one of the things I'd also say to that is, to the extent that you can be sharing this sort of information with your employees too, is also particularly helpful, because you can actually essentially this information doesn't just need to be for a manager, for example. You can give people a sense in which, you know how busy the week is going to be, and you know what day is likely to be like under or overstaffed in advance, if that makes sense.
Right. Interesting. That's great. Bo, I'd love to kind of kick it off to you and talk a little bit about pulling it all together, and taking what we've learned from Jack and his awesome product at Alondo and pulling it into scheduling.
Yeah, sure. So obviously on the screen you've got a little easier math equation than I think what we've been describing beforehand, which is basically what we're trying to do. The crux of the solution is just to put some humanity into your data-driven schedules. So you obviously want data, the work to be done as a driver of force, but you also want to humanize things. So we want to make sure, we've talked a lot about burnout. We've talked about underscheduling and overscheduling and all the impact that happens for the employee experience in these different situations. And the reality is that when you are driving the bottom line so deep, you're actually hurting yourself in a lot of ways. And so by taking in that internal qualitative data, like when people's preferred shifts are, giving them more aligned schedules according to what they can predict themselves, getting people to work with others that they like working with. All of these are kind of ways that the system can learn the best way to optimize a schedule. Because at the end of the day, we want to make sure we are humble enough to know when we are at 60%, and we're intelligent enough to know what it's going to take for us to get to those higher percents.
Right. And what I guess what an accurate depiction, and I feel like this word is so overused, so I almost hate to say, I feel like it's a buzzword, but would it be considered machine learning, or would it just be considered truly a dynamic source of collecting data?
Yeah, Jack might be better to answer that one. I actually think it's a combination of both, isn't it?
Yeah, I get technically yes. I think the issue is, okay, under the hood there are the like state-of-the-art fancy machine learning algorithms that, for example, generating the forecasts. They're also actually running a lot of the optimization engine. I think the issue is AI, I think, is used as a bit of a buzzword to just imply that something is going to be good for the sake of it,
right?
Than actually think rather than being somewhat more problem led. And so it goes back to that. It's great if your optimization engine is AI powered, but if it's generating the same thing each week, and managers are spending 2 hours changing what it generates, the fact it's AI is irrelevant in some sense. I think the thing, the novelty and what's kind of nice is this ability to use to see what is happening, to see how a manager is reacting to the schedules that you generate, and then learning from that to actually make sure that you improve next time.
That's interesting. Okay. Cameron had a good question in the chat. She asked, what if the forecasted schedules are wrong? Is this even possible? If so, how do you go about correcting it? Bo, I'll ask you first, and then Jack, I'm kind of interested to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I think the question should more be when the forecasted schedules are wrong, rather than what if, because it's probably more of a reality that as Jack was talking about, if the health inspector comes in town, how do we predict those kind of events that impact the work to be done? The reality is that you're going to have variances. The goal is to always get as close to great as possible, but just allowing yourself the opportunity to learn from it and allow the system to learn from it. I think that's what matters most.
Definitely. Jack, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's kind of feeds back into everything that we've been talking about here, this idea of I think exactly like you say, but mistakes are inevitable, and I think there's some humility in accepting that at the end of the day, very hard to try and to get something that's going to be right every time. The key is, are you making sure you're learning from those things each week? And so if you see that you're constantly getting, you constantly see 3 weeks in a row, that you're automating schedules that are understaffing on a Tuesday. Well, you'd hope that by week 4, you've stopped making that mistake. There's always going to be, as you say, the health inspector is always going to come into town occasionally. There's always going to be these sort of idiosyncratic events that you can't control for. But the key is to try and make sure you're avoiding the sort of systematic mistakes that you're making over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, we just kind of hopefully are out on the other end of it, but we're literally experiencing a big, massive, unpredictable event like coronavirus, right? Where that was not in anybody's foresight, and let alone forecasting tools like Alando. So it's all about just adjusting and kind of learning as you're going, as you say.
Yeah, I mean, I say that's a great point too, because obviously the way all these machine learning models work is they're using the historical data to essentially recognize patterns that you can extrapolate forwards. And when you have a really big surprise event like coronavirus, it then becomes very, to what extent can you use a lockdown Christmas to forecast how Christmas is going to be the next year?
Yeah.
That poses its own challenges. And thinking about how do you just from a pure like modeling perspective, that's kind of fun to think about.
Yeah,
I did have a client too though who wanted to skip over a year, basically like, oh, that wasn't the correct correlation, like that's not our business. But I think that also, COVID in a lot of ways is still impacting the economy in varying degrees. I think the frequency or the variability is there, absolutely, but that data is still valuable, and it's probably a good indication that, like, will you return to 2019? Will you return to a greater 2020? Will your business return at all? That's all.
It's all very important to take into consideration, kind of regardless, right? And the last thing you want to do is almost cause a break in that learning process, especially tools like Alando, right, that do better over time and kind of age. I almost want to say age like fine wine, but I can't think of another. But it's true, right? I mean, it's something where the longer it stays out, the better.
Yeah, I mean, I think this point. I mean, I think we were speaking about this before that. The more data you have, obviously the better your forecasts are, going to be when it comes to like a forecasting problem. I think a lot of the time too, we do have in mind that that's something like time. But there is, of course, if you are a business with lots of locations, large data can also be leveraging the data you have across similar stores, for example. So going back to this health inspector story, it's quite unlikely the health inspector is going to be visiting all of your locations in a city at once. And so, what are the advantages of leveraging, the data across stores is you can kind of, the hope is you infer what was sort of random and one-off and what's, a systematic component that you're missing.
That's interesting.
That's a great point. Awesome. Bo, I'd love to hear a little bit more on kind of next steps that people can take, actionable solutions.
Yeah. So basically the goal should always be helping with that learning process, right? So these 3 steps up here are all about what we can do to proactively help support that learning curve going into the future. I think the worst thing you could do is, again, publish a schedule every single week and text people the changes that you want to make, or text them when you're getting called off, or just not being able to actually collect the data. At the same time, I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that if someone is the sole administrative of this data, it can be difficult to collect, right? So number 1, learn and adapt as you build your future schedules. Just be able and be willing to make those changes. Know that things are increasing over time, and you're getting a better product as you go along. Number two, you should be automating a little bit more about the qualitative aspects of those shifts. To Jack's point about how shift feedback, just an understanding of an employee's emotional response to a shift. As you automate that process of collecting that information, then I think that helps discern future scheduling patterns that you might want to take. And then the third is just being willing to adjust staffing, at the point of the shift actually happening. And I would reference the weather as Jack was saying earlier. There's a lot of variability farther out, and the closer that you get to the shift, even to the point of the shift itself, say it had a 90% chance of raining, today, and then it ended up being sunny all day, which we've all experienced. You make the adjustments, you learn from it, and that helps. That proactivity and real-time changes help predict that in the future.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Brendan asked a great question in the chat. He said, how often are on-demand schedules updated? And I kind of have a follow-up question to that. Why is it important that they're updated to begin with?
Is that to me?
Yeah, we'll kick it off to you, and then if Jack has any add-ons.
Gotcha. Actually, I'm not sure what on-demand schedules means.
I guess forecasted schedules, kind of just.
Oh, well, the reality I think is that they should be updated with every change of a variable or factor to it. So, whether that's real time, people clocking in and out, and or whenever you make changes or additions or subtractions to a schedule, those are all updates to how you impact that demand.
Yeah, that's awesome. And Jack, I'd love to know kind of from your end why it's so important to constantly be updating the schedules in real time as these new factors kind of come into play.
Yeah, I mean, I think from the I guess from the sort of the engineering perspective, the important thing is that essentially the goal is to put as much information in front of a manager as possible. And so even if it's not necessarily through regenerating schedules, the fact that you are able to regenerate demand forecasts as an event gets closer in time is essentially it's just very important for giving the manager as much visibility as possible over what the day is actually going to look like. So going back to this point earlier, if you're usually scheduling on a Friday, for example, and you're scheduling for 2 weeks at a time, it's very likely that in a week's time you're going to want to look at that demand forecast again to update the the decisions that you made the previous week. Because as we've been having throughout this whole discussion, the closer you get in time to the event, the better the less variability and the better those forecasts get, as they can take in more up-to-date information about the week ahead.
Yeah, that's great. Awesome. Bo, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this slide. Yeah,
and I think this feeds into that math equation, that math test we were talking about earlier, where what this graph is all about is really just describing the old way of auto scheduling, which is a concept probably within the last 20 years or so. Just this idea that we can solve all of these things by accounting for every single variable. We compute every single thing, make this really complex algorithm, and then we produce results, and those results don't align with expectations, and we adjust, we put more ratios, all these things are set, and you just end up manually scheduling based off previous weeks. And so why not learn from that information and provide the opportunity for you to alleviate work in the long run. So allow managers to drive that intuition, that frontline experience, so that you optimize your workforce in a way that's human for your frontline employees, works fast and efficiently for your managers, and saves the bottom line for your administrators.
Right. That's really interesting. Chase asked a great question in the chat. He said, I work as a manager of a hotel where we hold a lot of events. Can I manually input an event?
Well, I can only really speak for workforce.com, but at least in our software, we absolutely can do that. Yep.
Awesome. That's great. Yeah, that's I think that feeds really kind of well into the idea of predictability versus unpredictability. Even if you know that you have an event coming up, that the schedule or the machine learning algorithms might not predict for you, right? Of course, it still falls under the same wheelhouse. It's still, if you are kind of feeding those external factors to the data input aspect, it's going to crank out something that is really going to hit the mark on the staffing levels and kind of what it looked like for other events in the past, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, great. That's a great question, Chase. Thank you. Awesome. So I'd love to, close this out. Jack, I'll ask you first, if there's one or two things, tips, takeaways that our audience can, learn about how to forecast their schedule based on demand, what would you say those are?
Yeah, I think first, the most important thing really is, have a sense of exactly what you think your demand drivers are, and the demand drivers that you think that you can collect, and be aware that they may not be sort of just very obvious things like sales. So, for example, this idea that you can be using, the feedback that your employees give to get a better sense of how busy you are and how busy you're going to be in the future. Mm-hmm. And I think, that's probably the most important one, because at the end of the day, from an engineering perspective, the forecasting problem is somewhat a solved one. And the difficult one is the domain expertise over, what are the most important metrics that you need to drive success. So, if it was someone who's working with like workforce.com, making sure that you have your POS like integrated so that you can be using that information within like the workforce system.
That's great. That's awesome. Bo, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I would say number one point of advice or key takeaway would be to equip yourself with the right tools. A lot of this is essentially jargon if you don't have a way of processing it in a good way, quick, fast, and easy way for yourself. Number two is to be willing to learn. So you kind of a little bit to what Jack was saying, you may not understand the correlations quite as well as what the data might end up finding, especially if you've been doing scheduling processes in a really manual way beforehand. People can sometimes have a tendency to get stuck in their ways. Mm-hmm. And as you try and deploy these kind of solutions, just be willing for the opportunity for change. Know that you're the expert in a lot of ways, but let the data kind of drive that and help you along the way reach that A+ score.
Yeah, I like it. That's a great way to end it. Awesome. Well, thank you, Bo and Jack, so much for coming on. That was great. I know I learned a lot. I'm sure our audience did too. Before I let everybody go, I'm going to share this forecasting audit for everybody, just to kind of get a sense of where your data is currently, how it's being used, how you can better use it in the future. And until the next webinar, I'll see everybody then. Thank you guys again for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome.
Enjoyed it.